So if those who aren't following, the score's now tied 1-1. So personally, I was hoping for a Croatia-Belgium final. I thought that would have been a nice thing. What? Croatia could, but Belgium's gone. Yeah. And so we'll turn to the academia panel, and Maureen will moderate it.
Okay, well, thank you very much. So these are the results of the academia panel, and I must say that we focused primarily during the discussion on the first bullet. What do you and your organization need from the initiative? And I must say that I think there was a fair amount of agreement about this, and it was that the National Academies could do a service by sending a message that as part of the education of doctors, public health practitioners, and also people doing environmental health work in engineering schools or environmental engineering, that making environmental health part of the curriculum would be something that would be a big step forward, and this is something that this initiative could really support. And I think that was probably the biggest message that came out of the group. There were also points about getting research findings down to practitioners, and also having experts answer people's questions at the local level. So these were three themes that came out. But I'm going to introduce the three panelists and let them comment on this in more detail. So the first panelist here to my right is Tracey Woodruff, who is professor in the Department of Obstetrics, Gynecology, and Reproductive Sciences at the University of California, San Francisco. She's done extensive research on environmental health issues, particularly on early life development. She was at EPA in the Office of Policy, and also has been appointed to the Science Advisory Board of the Developmental and Reproductive Toxicant Identification Committee in California. I will introduce everyone right now, actually, in the interest of efficiency here. The next person is Lynn Goldman, who is the Dean of the Public Health School at George Washington University, was previously a professor at the Bloomberg School of Public Health at Johns Hopkins, and was also the Assistant Administrator for Toxic Substances during the Clinton administration. And our third panelist is Dr. Srirama Rao, who is a professor and associate dean for research at the University of Minnesota College of Veterinary Medicine. He is also appointed in the medical school there and is associated with the One Health COMOS program. So I will let each of the panelists describe their takeaways from this session.
Okay, are we going to go in order?
Starting.
Okay.
Why don't you
Why not? All right, thank you, Maureen. So to give a little bit of context from my perspective, so I'm at University of California, San Francisco, and that's an interesting place to talk about environmental health. So UCSF is, for those of you who are not familiar with it, a very prestigious medical sciences institution. We're number one in NIH funding in our School of Medicine. So there's a lot of science going on at UCSF. We're also the top 5 medical hospitals in the country, as well as graduate and medical sciences training programs. So UCSF is a very integral part about where healthcare and biomedical research is going. And to me, one of the things that would be very part of success for this program is that UCSF would be natural for them to embrace the environment as part of their healthcare mission. Now, I would say that we have made a lot of inroads at UCSF in terms of some of the things that we discussed within our panel, but I think the lesson that I have personally learned from being at UCSF is this initiative is so exciting, right? It feels timely. We've talked about how timely it is, but there's also an element of deja vu to it that we've talked about it again many times. So thinking about that, what is it? I think it's very important that we think about what is it that we keep talking about it, and we need to get more traction on this. And this is my own personal experience of being at UCSF. to us, it was the engagement with the larger health sciences community that's important, but also thinking about how do we speak to them in the language and the way that they are thinking about. And that is to work through their educational system. So we have been, as part of that, it's, well, how do we get them to care about having environment as part of their medical sciences curriculum, which we have been successful in introducing environment into the medical school curriculum. And it's in part because we're there, right? We're located in the institution. It's also in part because we've brought the science to the medical system, talk to them in a way that they understand. And then it's also engaging with the health professional society. So, for example, we led a very big initiative to engage the major health professional society that for OBGYNs, the American Congress of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, and through working with them and getting them to acknowledge environmental reproductive health as a topic that they should care about, that UCSF was integral to that conversation, that led them to then adopt this important message, and that then helped open the door for us to put in environmental health into the medical school curriculum. So, and then of course the training pipeline I think resonated among everybody in our group because training is going to be important, but there's many facets to education. I mean, I personally been focused on medical school education, but there's nursing, but then there's public health. So this is an issue that the Academy is well situated to address in the context of environmental health. But the other thing that I want to also bring up is it's that we've talked a lot about science. Of course, we're all from academic institutions and we do science, and we have a lot of science already, which was something we talked about. There's lots of science, but it's not penetrating out all of the science that we have. So looking at not just training about for students or professional students on why environmental health is important and how do they act on it, but also how do we do the training for them to understand the translation of that science into action. So something that we have been very deliberate in focusing on is developing tools to translate scientific information so it's useful for decision makers, whether it's the clinical decision maker or the policy decision maker, and making that a more deliberate part of how do we get science from the scientist out to the outside, because that's a training and process. There's a whole method to how you use science in decision making. There's also a whole method around policy analysis, et cetera. And that is something that academics are not so engaged with. So again, you just look at UCSF as a model. We have our, for example, an Institute for Health Policy Studies. That's a model for how healthcare policy is done. We don't have anything like that in environmental health, and we could be something that could be well served, which we talked about, which leads to the third point, was implementation is a key piece to making this have more legs. Again, we have a lot of science, but we don't having the different, I think, Chris, you talked about this, the case studies about the implementation of how you go from the science to the decision, even in the case where we have scientific uncertainty, which I think is a very important point, would be useful. And one thing we did, just to add what Maureen said, was when you do these case studies is to think about case studies that have the attributes that will make them, you can glean from them the lessons that you learn from those case studies so that they're applicable to other topics. And I'll just use the example that we used ourselves in our work in developing systematic reviews in environmental health. Was we actually looked to the clinical sciences to see how they did it and learn from how they went from non-evidence-based to evidence-based method. And I guess an example of that is Dan Fox, who used to be the president of the Milbank Memorial Fund, had a book called The Convergence of Science and Governance. And we just used how they did it in medicine and applied it to environmental health. And I think that's what we need, is kind of like a playbook, right? And so your case study should come up with a playbook about here's how you do it, because it's often just the doing that is a challenging part. So I'm going to turn it over to Lynn.
Thanks, Tracey. So I think it's interesting that we had a group of academics, and we actually refused to follow the directions that we were given. So just take note of that. Anyway, in a way, I think our discussions did cover all of that, because it's not a stretch to say that it's fairly clear, actually, to our community what we need, from the national academies, as well as how we contribute. I think we contribute every day. However, I think we were very excited by the idea that this new initiative will be able to scan forward in terms of what's important in environmental health, as opposed to what this organization often does, which is respond to the call for duty when, people ask the organization to do studies. It's very good at stepping up to the plate and doing the studies, but it hasn't been very proactive. It hasn't been engaged in scanning forward and actually going out to the community, say, but what do the nation's experts think is important and needs to be done? So we were pretty excited about that, and I think that's something that most of us would want to participate in. But obviously, for the education sector, as Tracey said, there are a lot of opportunities, and in particular, we feel that there, and I feel that there is a major disconnect in how we educate in environmental health, that we fail to provide the breadth of education that many people who are training to actually be a part of the environmental health system need. And whether that's in public health or engineering or people in health professions. And one of the people in the group said, we ought to have a way to provide the same basic curriculum to all of those in a language that they could speak, so that they can actually communicate with each other, because most knotty problems need all those people to come together. And frankly, most of us, I'll put myself in this, I'm not training very many people who are going to be academics and researchers. I'm training a lot of people who are going to be going out into the world to make a difference, to make the world healthier, to make people healthier. And they need the fundamental tools to be able to get that job done. And that does partly involve being able to work together across multiple sectors. The other piece that I find to be very fascinating and an opportunity is the way that I view that the healthcare delivery sector is very rapidly trying to shift in our direction. And what I find is that I'm often in groups, not like this one where I'm with other environmental people, but where I'm with people who are involved with healthcare delivery, healthcare insurance, and whereas 5 years ago I would have been the only person in the room who would have said prevention or population health or environmental or social determinants of health, I'm like the 8th person to say that now, because everybody is focused on value-based healthcare and wanting to not pay to make people sick and then make them well again, but wanting to keep people healthy. The problem is they don't really know how to do that. And part of why they don't know how to do that is what Tracey said, which is that the education that we have for people who are involved in healthcare delivery includes nothing about environmental health, maybe an hour or two or a few hours. They don't learn about ecology. They don't learn about so many of the things that you need to know if you're going to be practicing in the community to keep people healthy. And if that's the direction that the healthcare system says it's going, which it does say it's doing that, then eventually it's going to have to get around to saying, wait a minute, how do we produce people who know how to do that? I think that the other area that Tracey also mentioned, but I wanted to highlight, is that this area of implementation. There is a science of implementation, teaching implementation science. How do we test interventions? How do we actually go out there and scientifically prove which ones? And it's not going to be like doing clinical trials for individuals with different drugs, because these interventions need to happen at community levels and other levels, but they need to be evaluated carefully, because so much of what we do in practice has not been. And I think it's fair enough to point that out. But also that and one of the members of our group mentioned this, that we need to have the academics in there working with state and local public health people, but I would argue not just them, but also people in the healthcare system. If healthcare delivery systems are going to be delivering on population health, which is what they say they want to do, then those individuals need to learn how to work with people at the state and local level who are delivering environmental health. And I realize that that's very future-oriented and that's very difficult, but on the other hand, I'm willing to take them at their word that that's where they want to go.
Thank you, Lynn. I found out I was a panelist a few minutes before I joined the discussion, so some of the remarks I'm going to make are not prepared and off the cuff. I moved to Minnesota after being in California for about 20 years, and one thing I found out about Minnesota is there's a saying, Minnesota nice, so they don't speak much about themselves, so the art of communication. So for those of you who don't know University of Minnesota, it is a top 10 public university, and it is a large, comprehensive land-grant university in that it has, in addition to its health sciences mission, it's got agriculture, it's got animal health, and so with that comes the integration of much of what we are talking across the university-wide system, and environmental health and One Health has played a big role at University of Minnesota. So this has been largely helpful in our university kind of leading an approach that we call One Medicine, One Science, which is really what we refer to as science advancing One Health. And this is science in all its manifestations, whether it's social science or political science, medical science, or environmental and agricultural science, advancing the health of humans, animals, and the ecosystems we live in. So that integrated approach embraces environmental health in a big way. And so we've been hosting a series of international conferences that we call that Maureen referred to as COMOS, or the conference itself is the International Conference on One Medicine, One Science, and several in this room have attended this conference. And also, out of that has come the evolution of a global consortium called the Consortium on One Medicine, One Science. So it is an approach to problem solving where the fundamental appreciation is that science and evidence-based science needs to be the primary driver of evolution of policy, and then for policies to be implemented, what needs to happen. And so we recently had a global visioning meeting, and one of the things that came out of this meeting, and this was a meeting that was attended by not only academia, we had representation from around the globe, but from intergovernmental organizations and various stakeholders. And one of the challenges that evolved, or the appreciation that the greatest challenges to finding solutions to societal problems, including environmental issues, is implementation. And that is something that has constantly come out at the conversation we had and earlier today. And the understanding and appreciation, as was stated, there's a lot of science and scientific solutions floating all around. And it's just that somehow science has failed in effectively implementing key things that could make a fundamental change at a societal level, at the level of people who care and who can actually make that happen. So I suppose one of the challenges to implementation is that a lot of these solutions are not in any given silo, but they're across silos, they're across sectors, they're across disciplines. And a fundamental challenge for a lot of us is that we are not familiar with working across these sectors and challenges. Especially in academia, we are so glued to our comfort zone. So the other issue that seems to come up in evolving solutions is, I think we as scientists like to come up with what we think are solutions. These solutions, or scientific-based solutions, some of them do end up into policies, But in many geographies, these policies don't actually take root, because if they don't have economic outcomes, what good are policies? So in many geographies, as we start speaking to people and the stakeholders there, the first thing they tell us is, yeah, you can talk about all the science in the world, but if it's not going to have economic outputs, these solutions don't mean anything. So I think that is the challenge that we in academia face. How do we participate as part of that solution? So when it comes to implementation, things really break down at the multi-sectoral level. So as I said, these solutions, they are not just in academia or just in government or just in industry, but it's across these segments. When things happen, each of these individual silos do their job, and somehow it doesn't transform or move to the next layer or next level, and it gets lost in the cracks between these different sectors. So I think a growing challenge is, how do you work across sectors and do so in an efficient and an effective way? I think part of the problem, as we've come to understand and appreciate from a lot of people, is that it is a lack of comfort working outside of our comfort zone, especially academics, that we know that so well. And the second thing is, I think, the issue of trust. In many geographies, people don't trust their governments. They don't trust people in industry. Now, they feel, although these people are actually in many cases trying to come up with solutions, they feel that they have vested reasons. So the lack of trust or mistrust is a big problem, and I think that is where academia can play potentially a central role in bridging the various stakeholders, may it be academia, starting from academia, playing that role, but may it be industry, the NGOs, the private sector. And I think that is what a consortium such as this and many of the groups that are bringing together, where I feel academia, and that was stated here at our group too, can play a fundamental role in advancing some of these solutions in a way that, okay, so I need to stop. And so I'll be happy to talk more about that. But I think these are the things that if the academy can embrace and be that arm for communicating that message, I think it'll play a positive role.
Thank you. I think we basically just have time for maybe a couple of questions, do we? Okay. And let me just say one thing apropos of the implementation issue which has been brought up. Let's face it, with environmental health, you often have externalities which are difficult, which require regulation, and it's not just a matter of the lack of scientific information. And you also have issues of changing people's behavior, which is inherently very difficult. But I think we should move to questions so that we stay on point and on time. Yes.
I have a question from a web observer for Dr. Woodruff. What tools are UCSF using to translate science for decision makers?
Great. I don't even think I know you. So thank you for the question. We've done a couple. What we have been mostly focusing on is looking at how to evaluate evidence, the evidentiary base, in a more systematic, transparent fashion. So we have developed what we've called the navigation guide, which is a systematic review approach to evaluating scientific evidence that can create a bottom line summary about the strength of evidence of the relationship between some type of environmental exposure and a health outcome. It is based on what clinical medicine uses for systematic reviews, primarily through the Cochrane collaboration and the GRADE methodology, but with an important caveat that it's been modified to be able to evaluate animal evidence as well as human observational studies, which is not, as Lynn very well pointed out, not the evidence base that the clinical sciences community is familiar with, which I think is one of the challenges of, this is exactly why one of the reasons we started is because clinical sciences are largely unfamiliar with our science because they're trained primarily in RCTs. So we have to be able to talk to them in the language that they're used to, which is through these systematic reviews, and it also turns out that it's a improved method for being more transparent and systematically evaluating evidence, and provides an ability to then create a summary of that evidence so you can speak more clearly about what you know and what you don't know about the evidence base with more reliability, which the National Academy has done several reports on this. I'd say actually that series of reports has been extremely successful. Sometimes we talk about reports that have gone on the shelf, but this one actually we've seen a lot of uptake of these methods, particularly in the National Toxicology Program and now at EPA, and a lot of that has been because the National Academy of Sciences has been consistently reviewing and recommending this type of approach for them. So I think that's a good case study in a kind of implementation sciences approach.
Okay, the last question, please.
Richard Dennison, Environmental Defense Fund. I wanted to pick up on something, Tracey, you had said too, which deals with this issue and question of the influence of uncertainty in making environmental health decisions. And I would posit that uncertainty is incredibly inherent part of environmental health, in part because of the complexity, the multifactorial nature of the problems we're dealing with, et cetera. But uncertainty when it comes to decision making becomes in many ways an enormous barrier to implementation. And we have government that is implementing policies that often treat uncertainty as a basis for not taking action. We have a private sector that often exploits that or uses that as a basis for resisting implementation. And we have an academic community that in many cases, because of scientific standards and so on, seeks to kind of utilize uncertainty in a way that it removes their research from implementation or implementability in some ways. So I'm wondering whether the panel thinks that this aspect of environmental health warrants a look by the Academy. I mean, I know it was certainly a cornerstone of the Science and Decisions report, so it's not, you're no stranger to it. But is there a way to reapproach that issue in this context of advancing environmental health?
Well, I'm kind of looking at Ellen, who organized a workshop a few years ago in which I participated actually on uncertainty analysis, in environmental assessments. And I think the Academy has tried to address that time and time again, including in the vaunted Silver Book that Tom mentioned. There was a whole chapter in that book as well. And so I'm not sure that there's been an absence of intellectual effort on that. I do think that, in my own personal experience, I mean, if you can't tolerate uncertainty, you can't be in environmental health, so, just get over it. I mean, you need to be in a world where everything's certain, you find another career, because, I mean, that's the nature of the beast. And if you think about it, the criteria for causality that have been laid out, in public health, the postulates, you could never meet those for a chemical that is yet to come on the market. Yet you have to make a decision. Does it come on the market or not? Because no human has been exposed to it, right? So you can't meet those postulates. And so I think that I think it's more, if there's a way to advance this, maybe it would be, as Tracey said at the beginning, let's not keep running around that same track. I'd hate to see us have that workshop again and review those same papers that people have written, because I've been at several where, there are a few papers. And, is there a way to do a leap forward where instead of talking about that, we're talking about how we contend with that, make decisions with that, communicate through that. I myself, I would probably refuse to go to that workshop again, with all due respect to Ellen, as much as I love her and, the way that she puts workshops together.
Yeah, I just want to follow up on that. I think it's really about laying out the structure about how you approach making decisions in the uncertainty context. And I think the case studies, which I think Christy recommended, I think that's the way you have to do it. And I would actually point to the state of California did an excellent case study on EMFs, not the cell phone ones, but the actual big EMFs. And it was very illuminating because they used, it was a somewhat analytic approach, but they also, this is the other thing I think that's been important in that, was to bring in other stakeholders from a wide variety of including the industry plus people who were concerned about childhood cancers, to walk through this pretty analytic process, and all arrived at a very similar conclusion in terms of it wasn't to get rid of them, it was to not to bury them, which turned out to be so expensive, but to use some type of programming to have the interference between lower the amount of EMF coming off of the line. So I think it's not, we all know about uncertainty and we all know about it, but I think it's this making more explicit through these case studies how you will deal with different situations, and then partnering with people who are going to be doing the implementation. I think part of the implementation is the science and part of it is the partnerships, because you have to have people pick it up and do it, and that is a very challenging part. Not in the National Academy of Sciences probably is going to be doing that, but acknowledging that piece of it.
I'll do it very briefly by saying that I echo what she's saying. It's got to be an integrated approach. We in Minnesota, as an example, had the avian pandemic a few years ago. And one of the ways we said, how are we going to prevent something like this from happening again, is to actually bring into discussions academics, industry partners, government people, policymakers. And through that evolved a decision-making process of how to prevent something like this from happening again. And I think it's been very effective in some of the policies that have been put in place, but that would not have happened if we didn't have an open mind and have this sort of an integrated approach. So,
thank you to the
Thank you.
panelists. Thank you. We're not too much over time. Yeah. Well, not too much.